I knew something was wrong the moment I pushed through the glass doors into the main lobby of Pacific Grid headquarters in Los Angeles. Morning light spilled across the marble floor as usual, but the air felt different. It was missing something specific, something this building normally lived on. No greetings, no footsteps from engineering teams debating transmission routes, no landline phones buzzing nonstop at the coordination desk. Only a strange stillness, as if the entire building was holding its breath because it knew something before I did. I am Lena Marshall, 52 years old, System Safety Supervisor and Risk Coordination Lead at Pacific Grid. I am used to chaotic mornings, stacked safety reports, and emergency meetings that were never truly emergencies. But today, what set every instinct on alert was the silence itself. Silence that clean usually means one thing in my field, a problem someone is trying to cover. The receptionist saw me. On any normal day, she would greet me first. Today, her gaze slid away, quick and awkward enough that anyone could notice. I had not even set my bag down when my phone vibrated. An email appeared on the screen. The subject line, written in capital letters, read, "Performance review at 9:30 in room 23B. No body text, no signature, no attachment." The kind of email people send when they are dodging responsibility or preparing to push someone into a conversation whose ending has already been chosen. Decades in risk coordination teach you a certain form of intuition. It is never loud. It feels like a light tap along your spine, a reminder that something is coming. And this morning, that tap felt unmistakable. I walked down the hallway. No one looked at me. A transmission line manager I had worked with for 8 years abruptly changed direction. A young analyst, usually cheerful, spotted me and turned into the print room so fast she nearly dropped an entire stack of paper. Everyone behaved as if they were avoiding a puddle, only I had not noticed. I was not upset. I had lived through this before. In 2016, a flawed wildfire risk report in Riverside sent me into a meeting with a committee full of solemn faces. Eventually, they realized I was the only one who had read the wind pattern maps thoroughly, and the only reason a nursing home did not have to evacuate in the middle of the night. Some people sent thank you cards. Some avoided me for months out of embarrassment. Avoidance, to be honest, has never been new to my career. I stepped into my office and closed the door to shut out the uneasy hallway silence. On my desk was the cup of mint tea I had made the night before. I opened the lower drawer and took out a neatly tied bundle of documents. I did not need to review everything. I only turned to the page containing Clause 14B, a clause I insisted on adding during my contract renewal 2 years ago, after an internal investigation I was not part of but learned a great deal from. I skimmed the language, then closed the file. If they were truly planning a performance review on a Monday morning, without any supporting documents, I knew it was not a review. Real evaluations always include data reports, charts, year-over-year comparisons, and targets for the next quarter. A blank email with only a time and location is not an invitation for discussion. It is a signal that a conclusion has already been made. I placed the file into my bag and straightened my collar. I was not the one in a hurry. The ones rushing were the people trying to push me into room 23B without meeting my eyes. When I stepped into the elevator, memories of last year's blackout rushed back. A heat storm severed a transmission route, cutting power for 8 hours at a small nursing home in Ventura. I worked through the night in the coordination center, listening to nurses pleading for support as they tried to keep ventilators running on backup batteries. I learned that the most vulnerable people sense danger earlier than any formal warning system. They rely on small signals and experience. And I am thinking of you, the listener hearing this now. Many of you have lived through moments like that. I know you understand. So tell me, where are you listening from? Florida, Texas, maybe a small town in Iowa where everyone knows everyone. Leave a comment. I want to know who among you has walked into a room like 23B, a room where everything was decided before you arrived. The elevator opened on the 3rd floor. I stepped out. The hallway stretched long and bright but strangely empty. No conversations. No office doors are open. The energy safety posters on the walls, the ones I helped draft, felt almost ironic. Safety does not always come from procedure. Sometimes it comes from knowing when someone is building a trap. I stopped in front of room 23B. The polished metal nameplate reflected my face at me, calm, steady, unafraid. I took a breath, not to gather courage, but to adjust my voice. In my work, the voice must lead the emotion. A steady tone keeps the advantage. My hand closed around the door handle, and I stepped inside. When I stood inside in room 23, my hand resting lightly on the edge of the table, I felt something unmistakable. This morning was not the beginning of the trouble. It was only the next chapter of a story that had started years ago. A story with the color of smoke, the sound of wind, and a wind map no one had bothered to flip open. To understand Clause 14b, you have to go back to the moment when everything truly cracked. 3 years ago, Northern California had an abnormal summer. The heat was so intense that the pavement felt like it wanted to melt. And one afternoon, the sky shifted into a deep orange, as if someone had poured a bucket of burning paint across it. The wildfire spread faster than any forecast had predicted. Winds changed direction constantly, destabilizing the northern transmission grid until one substation went down entirely. When the outage alert appeared on the coordination system monitors, I knew immediately that someone would be in danger. A nursing home on the hill was the first to be affected. I had been through many incidents in my risk management career, but that night was unlike any other. I worked 36 straight hours, surrounded by blinking alarms, listening to a young nurse trying to stay calm. She spoke slowly, evenly, but her voice trembled. I could hear a ventilator struggling in the background, and I knew the backup battery would not last long. We pulled every resource we could: emergency vehicles, temporary power reroutes, backup supply from neighboring regions. But there was a window of real danger that I will never forget. The most vulnerable always sense risk more clearly than any predictive model. They know when a room begins to heat up, when silence turns into threat. When power was finally restored, I carried a small hope that leadership would see the incident as a warning. I brought the risk report to the meeting, complete with wind maps, load charts, and the alerts I had sent 2 weeks prior. But the meeting had nothing to do with any of that. I sat there, in the familiar chair, listening to the chief executive officer ask the only thing he cared about: whether the media had found out. The chief financial officer flipped through his notebook, calculating potential compensation if liability was assigned. The entire room talked about cost, image, and public perception. Not one person mentioned the patients inside the nursing home. Not one person asked why my warnings had gone unread. In that moment, I understood that the work I was doing and the organization I was doing it for were now two parallel lines that would never meet again. And then 3 days later, Mr. Greer appeared at my office door. No one at Pacific Grid failed to recognize him. He was the oldest in-house attorney, a man who had seen more leadership regimes come and go than the number of years I had spent in the field. He stepped inside and closed the door gently, as if he were afraid to disturb the files lying quietly in the room. He did not ask how I felt after the wildfire incident. He simply pulled out a chair, sat down, and placed a thin stack of papers on my desk. "Lena," he said calmly, "what you wrote in that report will make you a target." I looked at the pages. "A contract clause?" He nodded. I rewrote the language. Short, easy to skim. They will sign it because they will think it is only an insurance measure for a long-term employee. But it will protect you in the only way that matters legally. I held the draft of Clause 14b. It stated that if I submitted an urgent risk report and was terminated within 30 days afterward, the company would owe me full deferred compensation. But more importantly, the report would be automatically escalated to the federal level. The company could not block it, retract it, or claim they had not had time to review it. It was not a bomb. It was a mirror. A mirror that reflected exactly what they preferred to ignore. "Why are you helping me?" I asked. Mr. Greer gave a faint smile. "Because I have seen talented people punished simply for telling the truth. And because I am old enough to know that if you do not protect yourself, no one else will." During the following week, the clause was moved to the desks of the chief executive officer and the chief financial officer. Just as Mr. Greer predicted, they signed without reading carefully. The chief executive officer signed during a budget meeting. The chief financial officer signed while preparing for a shareholder presentation. To them, I was merely a senior employee with a steady record and no tendencies to cause trouble. They believed the clause would never matter. And me. I signed it late in the afternoon after a field inspection. My jacket still carried the smell of smoke from the half-burned forests outside the city. I did not sign to prepare for a fight. I signed because it felt like a responsibility. Risk reports cannot disappear simply because they do not align with someone's quarterly targets. Clause 14b was born in that context. Not from ambition, but from the truth that sometimes my work requires documenting what others refuse to face. This morning, as I stood in room 23, looking at the silent whiteboard and the neatly arranged chairs, I understood something simple. Time is loyal to its own memory. They signed because they believed they would never pay the price. But time does not forget. When I stepped into room 23B, the first feeling was not fear or unease. It was confirmation. Everything in the room spoke louder than any scripted opening from human resources. The curtains were drawn, light filtered through thick fabric, turning the room cold, like the setting of meetings organizations would rather erase from their history. There were no performance review documents on the table, no laptop, no charts, no performance notes. Only 3 people are sitting upright, waiting for me the way one waits for a ritual already approved. Chief Executive Officer Adams sat on the left, his deep blue suit perfectly pressed, but his face strained in a way he could not control. He was never good at hiding emotion, and this morning made that even clearer. Chief Financial Officer Marissa kept staring at her silver ring, twisting it over and over as if she were searching for the correct angle of a bad decision. And Stephanie, the head of human resources, sat in the center with her hands neatly placed atop a thin folder, the kind of folder that contains only one item, an ending. The door closed behind me. I remained standing. The 3 of them looked at me as if waiting for me to collapse into the chair under the weight of shock. But the truth was, I had already seen every sign leading here. And when you enter a room prepared for your downfall, sitting down can sometimes feel like surrender. So I stayed on my feet. Stephanie began speaking. Her voice was so steady, I knew she had rehearsed the script more than 10 times. Lena, thank you for being here this morning. We truly appreciate your contributions to Pacific Grid throughout the years. However, the company is entering a restructuring phase. And I raised a hand gently, stopping her before she could finish. Restructuring, I repeated, my voice calm, or saving $4 million in compensation. The question dropped onto the table like a stone thrown into still water. Adam flinched. Marissa stopped twisting her ring. Stephanie stared at me as if she could not believe I would speak that plainly. Adam swallowed and leaned back. Lena, this is not. I simply asked for clarity, I continued, because if this were a performance review, there would be data. And if this were restructuring, my name would not be the first on your list. Marissa avoided my eyes. Stephanie flipped to the next page in her folder as if hoping it held instructions that would save her. But separation documents never contain anything miraculous, only silence and signatures. Finally, Stephanie resumed her script, slower now, more cautious. Your current role is no longer aligned with the future direction of the company, and this decision is effective immediately. Effective immediately. Those 2 words are always delivered with perfect coldness, as if companies fear that allowing a dismissed employee to exist for a few more hours might cause the building to collapse. I had heard the phrase many times in other cases. I never imagined hearing it from the people seated in front of me. Stephanie pushed a thin stack of papers toward me. This is the official notice. I glanced at it but did not touch it. I understand, I said. And my access card. Marissa took a key card from a small wooden box and set it down awkwardly. We will complete the administrative steps today. I picked up the card. No tight grip, no shaking hands. I had overseen hundreds of crises in my life. A rushed personnel decision was not the thing that unsettled me. What I watched closely instead was the expression on their faces. None of them looked like someone who had actually read my contract. So I asked, in the same even tone I used when directing a night shift, You have all reviewed my contract before signing this decision. All three nodded almost simultaneously. Too fast, too mechanical. Just like people who sign documents without ever reading the last line. A confused chief executive officer, a chief financial officer who avoided eye contact, a head of human resources relying entirely on a script. Enough for me to know they had not reviewed Clause 14b. I let silence sit in the room for a few extra seconds. Not to intimidate them, but to let them feel the weight of the question they refused to face. Good, I said finally. I simply wanted to make sure everything was properly verified. I placed the card on the table, signed the acknowledgement of separation, and stepped back. No one said another word. No thank you. No regrets. No wishes of good luck. Perhaps they believed silence would shield them from responsibility. Perhaps they believed I would walk out of this room like someone whose life had just lost its foundation. But experience had taught me that silence does not hide the truth. It only makes the truth louder. I turned, opened the door with a calm they never expected, and walked out. No bowed head, no glance back, no heavy breath. I left the room as if I had just finished an ordinary systems safety meeting, one where nothing dramatic happened, whether I spoke or left. The hallway outside remained quiet. No one looked at me, no one followed, and none of them knew that Clause 14b, the clause they never read, had just begun writing the next chapter of this story. I left room 23 with the posture of someone closing an old file, not someone whose career had ended, because they did not know that this meeting was not my ending. It was the beginning of theirs. The elevator opened on the ground floor, but I did not step out. People who have just been dismissed usually choose the quickest path out of the building. But this morning, I had no reason to rush or avoid anything. Instead of pressing basement 2, I raised my hand and pressed 32. If floor 23 was where they tried to bury the truth, then floor 32 was where the truth could not be hidden under any conference room carpet. The doors opened, and the air changed immediately. The smell of fresh paper, sharp white lights, the quick, steady sound of typing. The legal and compliance floor carried the cold atmosphere I had always called the temperature of truth. This was where every word had to stand upright, and every nod needed evidence behind it. Noah saw me first. He had just set his coffee down, not even finished adjusting his collar. "Mrs. Marshall, I thought you were in a meeting. I just left a meeting," I said. "And I need the legal team, specifically you and Priya." Noah did not ask questions. He guided me past the workstations to a small room by the window where Priya was working. Priya looked up from her screen when she heard our steps. She removed her glasses, brows narrowing, as if her instincts were already scanning the situation. "Lena, is something wrong?" I placed the folder on her desk. "Clause 14b. And the risk report I submitted 3 weeks ago." Neither of them reacted dramatically, but the glance they exchanged told me they understood this was not a simple administrative issue. Noah opened the contract first. When he reached 14b, he stopped and read more slowly. "You were terminated within 30 days of submitting the report." 21 days, I said. He leaned back slightly, as if creating physical distance helped him see the problem more clearly. "Then the clause activates automatically. No performance review required. No negotiation." "I know," I said, "but that is not the important part." I pushed the report toward Priya. "Check the federal submission status for me." Priya was already typing before I finished speaking. She looked at the screen, her eyes narrowing into a sharp line. A yellow icon blinked. She turned the monitor toward me. "This report never went out," she said. "It is still in the internal system. It is 14 days overdue." Noah leaned in to read the metadata. Submission date. Internal recipient. No delay justification. He exhaled softly. They put it in the queue and never sent it. Priya ran another command to check the logs. Under federal rules, a priority 1 report must be transferred within 7 days. A 3-week delay without notation is not just an operational lapse, it is a compliance violation. No one raised their voice, no one said anything dramatic. But the room grew heavier, as if the 3 of us now saw the real outline of this morning. Not merely a dismissal to avoid compensation, but an attempt to suppress an inconvenient risk report. Noah spoke quietly. "What do you want us to do?" I am not looking for scandal, I said. I just want the procedure followed. If they want to fire me, that is their right, but obligation is not optional. Priya nodded first. You were right to come here. No report should ever be held this long. Noah opened a new document to draft the record. His fingers typed quickly and firmly, the firmness of someone young who understood he was now touching part of the truth. I will send this to Meredith, Noah said. She will have to address it immediately. Add the contract file with 14B, I reminded him. I am attaching it. Priya downloaded the system logs. I will certify the submission time and the fact that it was held. No further words were needed. The three of us, a recently dismissed employee, a young attorney, and a meticulous compliance officer, understood that once this record was sent, nothing could return to the way it was. When Noah pressed send, I heard the small clicking sound, but it rang like the switch that begins a falling line of dominoes. Noah turned back to me, his voice soft but steady. You are ready for this. I am only doing my part, I said. The rest is not mine to carry. I thanked them both and left the room. As the elevator doors closed, I saw my faint reflection on the steel surface. Calm, not bitter, not victorious, not defeated. Simply someone who had placed the truth exactly where it belonged. On the ground floor, I stepped into the sunlight outside. The wind carried a trace of salt from the Santa Monica coast, the kind of scent that reminds you life is larger than glass towers and scripted conference rooms. I walked to the familiar cafe near the shoreline where I had spent many late afternoons after long shifts. I chose a table on the patio and ordered black tea. The waves in the distance rose and fell steadily, and the people passing by had no idea that just a few floors above the place I had left, a cluster of rushed signatures had begun to betray the people who had written them. I took a sip of tea. No tension, no anticipation. When you follow the law, waiting is not worrying. It is simply part of the process. 14 Biki was out of the drawer, and once it steps into the light, no one can return it to the dark without paying for it. Meredith finished reading Noah's report at 10:14 in the morning. Her hand paused for a beat, not because she was surprised, but because she understood exactly what it meant. What she held was not an internal issue that could be resolved with a few emails. It was the kind of incident that forced an entire board of directors to abandon their golf course immediately. In less than 10 minutes, she was standing inside the executive conference room on floor 25, where sunlight streamed through the glass facade with its usual sense of polished luxury. But today, no one was admiring the cityscape stretching across Los Angeles. No one was in the mood to appreciate anything. Adam, the chief executive officer of Pacific Grid, arrived first. He tried to maintain the expression of a leader, but the tie cinched too tightly around his neck, betraying him. Chief Financial Officer Marissa came next, holding a cup of coffee she had not taken a single sip from. Stephanie from Human Resources kept flipping an empty sheet of paper as if hoping an answer might magically appear. Meredith placed the folder on the table. No introduction, no softening. We have a problem. Adam folded his arms, his voice caught between irritation and worry. What file is that? The restructuring is already done. Meredith opened the folder and turned it toward him. This morning's dismissal activated Clause 14B, and Mrs. Lena Marshall's risk report has been held in the system for 3 weeks without being forwarded to the federal agency. The words struck the conference table like a heavy object sinking into deep water. Marissa slammed her cup down hard enough for coffee to splash over the rim. No, that cannot be. 14B only applies if the termination is related to the risk report. Meredith shook her head, calm in an almost unnerving way. The clause does not require a reason. It only cares about timing, and timing is not on your side. She traced her finger along the highlighted section. Report submitted. Termination within 30 days. Company obligations activate automatically. Adam lifted his brows in protest. We terminated because of restructuring. It has nothing to do with the report. The clause, Meredith said slowly, does not ask why. It asks when. Stephanie tried to speak, her voice trembling slightly, despite her attempt to keep it steady. Maybe the report was incomplete. We could argue it did not meet the standard. Meredith turned her eyes on her, and that alone was enough to silence her. The report was submitted through the official channel. Metadata is fully documented. I suggest you do not question the validity of system evidence. The room fell into a dense stillness. No shuffling paper, no nervous tapping, only the collective realization that they had stepped squarely onto a live mine. Marissa spoke next, her voice rough. Is there any way to nullify 14B? We cannot afford that payout. Meredith closed her eyes for a brief second. No, 14 gang was signed 3 years ago. Fully recorded. The signatures of the previous chief executive officer and chief financial officer remain legally binding. Adam shifted tactics, speaking faster. Fine, then negotiate. Bring Lena back in. Offer her a partial payout, an NDA, job placement, anything. Meredith leaned back, silent for a moment before she responded. Lena triggered the clause correctly and attached the risk report. Once the file reaches me, I am required to escalate it to the board of directors. We are no longer within the boundaries of private negotiation. Adam struck the table lightly with his palm. Then fix the logs. We still have time. Meredith looked at him as if he had suggested burning down a police station. No one in this room is allowed to touch the logs. The system records every modification, and tampering with data related to energy infrastructure is a federal offense, not an internal mistake. She enunciated each word. Do not think about that again. The room went silent as stone, and for the first time since the meeting began, Adam seemed to understand the magnitude of the situation. Meredith continued, her voice lower but carrying far more weight. The risk report concerns infrastructure impacting a nursing home. If the federal agency discovers the delay, it will launch an immediate investigation. There is no workaround. Marissa pressed her fingers to her forehead as if bracing against a rising headache. If the board learns about this, they will think we tried to hide it. They will not think, Meredith replied. They will conclude, because the system logs show exactly that. Adam stared at the table for a long moment. Then Meredith, what is the next step? Meredith closed the folder. The sound of the papers settling was as final as a full stop. Reporting to the board of directors today. Stephanie let out a small cry. Today. Impossible. They will treat this as a high-level violation. And they should, Meredith said plainly. The company delayed a risk report, then terminated the person who submitted it within the activation window of a protection clause. None of us has the authority to keep this quiet. Adam sat still, like someone hearing a verdict. No more arguing, no more blaming. Only the late realization that they had opened a door without knowing what waited behind it. Meredith stood and gathered the folder. I will send a formal notice to the board. Once I do, this is no longer an air management issue. It becomes a legal nightmare for the company. No one stopped her. No one had a defensible reason to try. The door closed behind Meredith with a soft click, but inside the conference room, that sound echoed through each of them like the final alarm before everything collapses. The board meeting was convened in the early afternoon, so quickly that one member had not even finished leaving the airport. 3 members were present in person at Pacific Grid headquarters. Interim Chair Helen Price, Independent Audit Specialist Marcus Hill, and long-standing member of the Compensation Committee, Mrs. Dana Whitmore. The remaining member joined through the large screen, airport wind still audible in his headset from Denver. Meredith entered the room like someone carrying the map of a battlefield everyone else had only begun to imagine. She placed the thin but heavy folder on the table. Helen spoke first, her voice calm in the way only someone who had survived 5 federal investigations could manage. Meredith, your emergency meeting request this morning forced us to cancel our schedules. I expect a reason that matches that level of urgency. Meredith nodded and opened the first page. I will be direct. Pacific Grid has just activated Clause 14B unintentionally, but fully validly. And at the same time, the company has violated federal risk reporting procedures. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. No dramatic expressions, but the eyes of every board member sharpened, the kind of sharpness reserved only for situations that could cost a company millions of dollars or its license. She continued, 3 weeks ago, Mrs. Lena Marshall submitted a Level 1 risk report regarding the Santa Lucia substation. The report was logged in the system but never forwarded to the federal agency as required. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Not forwarded. System failure or human? Meredith turned her laptop toward them. Human. The system had no issues, and the metadata shows the report was viewed but not sent. Helen leaned back, hands clasped calmly. Go on. Mrs. Marshall was terminated this morning, only 21 days after submitting the report. Clause 14B was designed as a protection mechanism for the reporter. If they are dismissed within 30 days, the company must pay the full deferred compensation along with all associated obligations. Meredith separated a marked page. This clause was legally signed by the prior chief executive officer and chief financial officer 3 years ago, and it cannot be voided. Dana reviewed the document, her lips tightening. And did the leadership know this clause existed when they made the termination decision this morning? No, Meredith answered plainly. They did not review the contract. The decision was made based on restructuring suggestions from the finance department. On the video screen, the remote participant gave a dry laugh. A personnel decision without checking the contract. At a company of this scale. Excellent. Helen tapped the table lightly, bringing everyone back to focus. We need to understand the scale of the damage. Meredith read without emotion. Deferred compensation, $4 million. Additional obligations under 14 AB, approximately $1.5 million. Potential federal penalties for delayed risk reporting, not specifically quantifiable, but maximum penalties far exceed any individual payout. Marcus looked up. Stock impact, significant if the information leaks. Reputation damage is also serious, especially because the report concerns a nursing home. No one spoke for several seconds. In that silence, each person understood this was no longer an administrative mistake. It was a threat that could destroy a financial quarter and the company's standing with federal regulators. At last, Dana set her pen down. Why was the report not forwarded? That is the central question. Meredith turned toward the door. That question should be posed to the Chief Executive Officer and Chief Financial Officer. Adam and Marissa entered when called, their expressions confirming they knew the moment of accountability had arrived. After the recap, Helen asked simply, "Why was the report not forwarded?" Adam spoke first, trying to maintain an even tone but unable to hide the lack of confidence. "We believe the report was still in internal review. The transfer to the federal level may have been delayed due to workflow issues." Marissa added quickly, "We did not receive any reminder notifications, and Human Resources was undergoing restructuring, so coordination may have been." Marcus cut her off. "You are describing a process issue, but the system logs show the report was read." "Who read it?" Neither Adam nor Marissa answered. A silence stretched, longer than polite. "At last," Adam said, "we will need to verify that." Helen shook her head slowly. "No, you read it, and you did nothing." Her voice was not loud, but firm enough to chill the entire room. Meredith continued, "The board must determine the next steps. At present, I see two options." Dana nodded, looking toward the others. 1. Negotiate a quiet settlement with Mrs. Marshall to minimize immediate damage. 2. Comply fully with all legal requirements, including forwarding the report, issuing an internal disclosure of the violation, and initiating a responsibility investigation. Marcus tapped his pen, thinking. A quiet settlement may lessen media pressure, but it does not address the root problem. Full compliance risks heavy penalties, but protects the company in the long run. The remote participant added, "Both are expensive. The only difference is which one costs more," Helen concluded. "We cannot allow this situation to unfold on its own. The first action is to approach Mrs. Marshall officially." She turned to Meredith. "Contact her through external legal representation, not through internal human resources. No explanations, only a request for discussion." Meredith nodded, gathering the documents. "I will proceed immediately." As she stepped out, the door closed softly behind her, but that softness felt like a hinge shutting on an entire era. Pacific Grid had just entered the waters no corporation ever wants to swim in. The waters where the board no longer asks why this happens, but begins asking how we survive this. The Santa Monica afternoon had a kind of light that made everything look more honest. The ocean, the salt crust on the wooden railing, and all the things people had spent years trying to hide. I sat at my usual table on the cafe patio, a cup of black tea beside me. I had handled countless crises from this very spot, from statewide outages to summer wildfires, but never had I found a moment of stillness like today. My phone began to vibrate at 3:17 in the afternoon. A name appeared, Stephanie, Human Resources. I let it ring. 1 minute later, a message came through. Lena, we would like to revisit some misunderstandings from this morning. If you return to the office, we can present a new proposal. I looked at the message, set the phone down, and did not reply. Adjustments, in situations like this, rarely aim at truth. They aim at the hope that I would grow tired and compromise. The second vibration came almost immediately. I answered, Marissa, Chief Financial Officer. Lena, she began, her voice trembling slightly. I think there is common ground for both of us. I am listening, I said. We want to offer financial support, not related to the disputed bonus. If you agree to pause the risk report, at least until we manage things internally. I stirred my tea gently. Marissa, you know I cannot do that. It is not hiding, she said quickly. Just delaying. The report will still be sent, just in a way that is more favorable to the company. Favorable to the company, I repeated slowly, is not the same as truthful. Marissa lowered her voice. Lena, I am trying to keep this from escalating. You could help us avoid unnecessary damage. Unnecessary damage, I echoed. That would be when we hide a threat affecting a nursing home, or when we dismiss the person who submitted the report to save a bonus. She fell silent. I heard her sigh. You will not reconsider. No, Marissa, I do not sell silence, and I do not sell responsibility. I ended the call. The third call came from an unknown number, but I recognized the voice the moment he spoke. I am Robert Wells, External Counsel for Pacific Grid. I would like to discuss a non-disclosure arrangement that benefits both sides. I leaned back in my chair. I assume you have a number. Correct, he said, steady. If you refrain from pursuing Clause 14b and do not advance the risk report, we can offer a substantial sum. Not equal to the full bonus, but enough for you to feel respected. Mr. Wells, I said, a risk report is not a decorative item. It is not negotiable. It is not negotiation, he corrected. It is a mutually beneficial arrangement. If the benefit is built on silence, I said, then it is not a benefit. He paused. Mrs. Marshall, consider the practical side. Litigation is long, draining, and expensive. You are no longer at an age where battles feel worth fighting. I laughed softly. Mr. Wells, if age determined ethics, this country would not have people over 70 still standing in court to defend their communities. He said nothing more. I ended the call. I thought I would have a few minutes of peace, but the fourth call arrived. This time, the name made me pause. Dana Whitmore, Board of Directors. I answered. Hello, Dana. Lena, she said, her voice slow and thoughtful. I want to speak not as a board member, but as someone who has lived through many difficult choices. I am listening. Why do you refuse to settle? Dana asked plainly. You could take the money, rest, and close this chapter. No one would blame you. I watched the sunlight glint across the ocean, waves rising and falling like the city's long breath. Because I still believe responsibility is real. She waited for me to continue. Dana, I have stood in blackout control rooms while people panicked. I have heard nurses calling for help because elderly patients lost power in the middle of the night. If I do not protect the truth, I know I will live with that longer than any courtroom battle. She exhaled, not in frustration, but in understanding. You know, most people our age choose comfort, but sometimes someone has to choose what is right. A sharp warmth rose behind my eyes, not sadness, but the rare feeling of being understood. I do not want to fight them, I said. I just do not want to walk away from myself. Then stand on the right side, Dana said. The board needs to know what you want. I nodded, even though she could not see it. After the call, I opened my laptop. I did not need a speech. I did not need justification. Truth does not need ornament. I typed one sentence and sent it to the board's independent legal team. Let us begin by doing exactly what was signed. I hit send. The Santa Monica sky remained clear, the waves steady, and for the first time in years, I felt my mind as calm as the water. not because of victory, but because I still could choose what was right. The Pacific Grid Board of Directors never made major decisions in a single meeting, but this time was different. Not because they wanted speed, but because time no longer belonged to them. The next morning at 8:03, my inbox displayed an email from the independent legal office. The subject line was brief: confirmation of Clause 14B, execution. I opened it without haste and without caution. My eyes went straight to the lines at the center of the email. Payment amount $4 million. Completed. Additional compensation per clause 14B $1,250,000. Processing. To many people, those numbers would feel like a monumental victory. But to me, someone who had worked in places where 30 minutes without power could cost an elderly patient their last chance at life, money was only paperwork. What mattered more was happening inside Pacific Grid's executive floors. Around 10 in the morning, I received a message from Dana. Adam will be reassigned internally. In truth, removed from the chief executive officer position. I read it without satisfaction. Adam was not a bad man. He was simply someone who believed that good enough was enough in an industry where good enough was the most dangerous illusion. Minutes later, another email arrived. Chief Financial Officer Marissa has agreed to depart the company under a settlement. I set my phone down beside my tea. Power does not always stand on competence. Sometimes it stands on luck, the inattention of others, and the belief that rules apply to everyone except oneself. Marissa fell at the third. Within Pacific Grid, what happened next no longer belonged to me. But I heard pieces of it through former colleagues, through messages from people who had once run the hallways with me at midnight. Meredith, in her usual fashion, began a full procedural audit as if rewriting the operating laws themselves. Priya from compliance was assigned to rebuild the risk report pathway. Noah, the young attorney, became responsible for restoring a culture that recognized early warning signs instead of dismissing them. I understood clearly my victory was not in the money. It was that these younger people now had the chance to rebuild a system that people in my generation had fought to keep intact. By noon, my inbox lit up again. This time, not from the board, not from legal. It came from an address I did not recognize: jtaylor@pacificgrid.com. Subject: thank you for not looking away. I opened it. Mrs. Marshall, I am a new engineer, 6 months into Pacific Grid. I know I have no right to speak on behalf of anyone, but I wanted to thank you. I used to fear speaking up when something looked off, thinking someone young should not upset leadership. But when we heard your story, we realized what we saw was not minor. If those before us do not hold the line, we do not know where to stand. I hope you continue doing what you believe is right, even now that you have left this place. I read the email twice, not because it was complicated, but because something inside me shifted, gently, like the quiet sound of a door closing after a long chapter, meaningful without being loud. That afternoon, I went back to my old office to pack my things, not to see anyone, just to place a period at the end of a sentence I had spent years writing. The receptionist looked at me with a mix of sympathy and respect. Would you like me to bring a packing box? No need, I said with a smile. I have been here longer than you think. I know where everything of mine lives. My office was just as I had left it, orderly, perhaps too ordered, as my colleagues used to tease. The thick winter coat I used on field inspections hung by the door. A photo of the Santa Lucia nursing home after we restored power stood on the shelf, and my yellow sticky note still sat on the corner of my monitor. Ask the right question before deciding. I gathered my things slowly, as if each item carried a memory. I did not feel regret. I only wanted to end this chapter by choice, something I had not been given in the termination meeting. That evening, I boarded a flight to Seattle. Not for rest. I had accepted a role advising a startup developing grid, risk monitoring technology. They wanted guidance, not for reputation, but for the practical experience I had earned over nearly 3 decades. Seattle greeted me with its familiar light rain. I stood by the hotel window, watching the lights shimmer across Lake Union. This city knew nothing about the debates, signatures, or hallways I had left behind. and it did not ask me to carry resentment with me. When the plane lifted off from Los Angeles, I looked back at the Pacific Grid headquarters one last time. Through the airplane window, it appeared small, like a model resting on a desk. I felt no anger, no longing, only clarity. There are chapters in life we are not meant to cling to, no matter how much of ourselves we gave to them. And sometimes, a single moment, like the email from that young engineer, reminds us that leaving can be its own form of protecting what we believe is right. Pacific Grid will continue, and so will I. Both are moving forward in entirely different directions. I had been in Seattle a little over 3 weeks when the first message from Pacific Grid appeared in my inbox. It was not a legal notice, nor a late attempt at settlement. It carried a subject line so brief it felt almost modest. The risk report has been fully submitted to the federal agency. Attached was a PDF confirmation, stamped by the Technical Oversight Office. No explanation, no justification. Just the fact that the process had finally been carried out the way it should have been from the beginning. I sat in my small office overlooking Elliott Bay, watching a thin layer of fog drift across the water. Seattle always had a dampness that softened everything, even the sharpest memories. I opened the second email. This one came from a board member, someone I had met only 3 times in my 20-year career. His tone was low, concise, and sincere. He apologized. Not for the money. For the system, he had allowed it to slip while he chased quarterly profit reports. He wrote that they should have seen the warning signs sooner. They should have listened to what I reported. No one should need a clause like 14B to force people to do their jobs. I replied with a single line. 14B was never about the money, and I meant every word. Money is visible, quantifiable, transferable. But the parts no one sees are always heavier. The trembling voice of the nurse during the outage that year, unsure how to keep her patients alive in the dark. The young engineer is standing under a flashlight beam, trying to keep a panel from collapsing. Money was never the point. The point was that if no one takes responsibility, it can all happen again, anytime. Most people listening to this story have lived long enough to understand something simple. Age is not what makes us tired. Absurdity and dishonesty are what wear people down fastest. Many of you in your 60s and beyond have signed more forms than the younger generation can imagine. Insurance papers, transfer papers, medical documents, mortgage contracts, every one of them with tiny text at the bottom, the place the writer hopes you will not read. So let me say this as directly as I know many older listeners appreciate. If someone hands you a thick stack of papers and says you do not need to read it, that is exactly when you need your glasses most. I do not say this to plant distrust. I say it because a lifetime in risk management taught me one truth. Clauses exist to protect someone. If people do not want you to read the clause, it might be protecting you, not them. And trust, whether in a company or in a family, is never built by hiding information. I tell the story of 14B, not to boast about a victory. I tell it because many of us, especially past 50, begin to believe that work should become simpler, that there is no need to push back anymore, that silence keeps life easier. But experience has taught me the opposite. When we stay silent, others grow even more confident that we will remain silent. And so mistakes repeat until one day the system collapses at the exact weak point someone could have reinforced. That afternoon, after replying to the email, I put on my coat and stepped onto the balcony. Seattle's quiet drizzle fell without a sound. A silver sky lay over the buildings, making the city look like it was breathing softly. I stood there long enough to notice my shoulders were no longer tight the way they had been in Los Angeles. No more waiting for a sudden call, no more invisible armor each time I stepped into a conference room. I remembered how Adam had avoided my eyes in room 23B, how the chief financial officer held her pen with a faint shake, as if she wanted to sign quickly and step out of the storm she could not measure. I thought of the human resources manager reading the termination script in that hollow voice, perhaps not believing a word of it herself. Then I remembered the young engineer who had sent the thank you email earlier. That meant more to me than the $4 million. Because if the younger generation recognizes the value of doing what is right, then this system still has hope. I rested my hands on the railing, the cold metal seeping into my skin. Life rarely gives us perfect endings, but sometimes it gives us a chance to close a chapter clearly, without bitterness. 14B turned out to be only a sheet of paper, but it became a slow test for everyone involved, a test of who reads, who takes responsibility, who looks for shortcuts, and who chooses to do the right thing even when no one applauds. If you have listened this far, you have likely had your own version of Room 23B. An unexpected meeting, a cold email, a superior saying something you knew was not true. If you want to tell that story, leave it in the comments. I read them all, and someone else may need to hear them. And if you want more quiet but sharp stories, where a single clause can tilt an entire system, you know what to do. Subscribe. No bells or whistles, just stories about how ordinary people still manage to stay decent in a world that moves a little too fast. Seattle had no sun that afternoon, but it felt bright enough to begin a new chapter. And this time, no one was waiting at a door with a performance evaluation. Only me, the soft rain, and the peace I had crossed many 23 floors to find.